My name is Linda Jennings, and I will be your presenter on roles and functions of supervisors empowering your teams. So let me start off with just telling you a little bit about myself. I grew up in San Antonio. I'm a graduate of the UT Health Science Center in San Antonio, Texas. I've been an occupational therapist and operations manager for over 30 years. And my experience is primarily in adult and geriatric rehabilitation. I have been a director of rehab, a regional rehab manager, a chief operating officer of a rehab company supporting 23 locations, and I am currently the vice president of clinical services and compliance at the Village of Incarnate Word. I'm also a certified resident assessment coordinator, and in my spare time, I enjoy traveling and spending time with my family. So upon completion of this course, the hope is that you'll have a better understanding of supervisory strategies and techniques to motivate your team. Also, to immediately improve your knowledge of characteristics of an effective leader. Now, this presentation comes from a therapist perspective, but if you are a non-therapist, maybe you're a nurse or an administrator, hopefully you'll find value, because I think with supervisory and manager responsibilities, it does really cross over to other disciplines. I've been both on the operations side and on the clinical side, so I think hopefully I'll add some value to your skills as a manager supervisor, or for some of those who have the desire to have that in your future. So today we're going to cover understanding the different models of supervision, examining the management approaches to supervision, and review strategies to motivate your team. So let's just start at the beginning. What is leadership? So the dictionary, the business dictionary, it defines it as an individuals who are leaders in an organization, the activities of leading a group of people or an organization. So when I sit there and I think about leadership, I've had great leaders and I've had not so great leaders. But what distinguishes a great leader from someone that's not effective? You know, there's the slide that you'll see a lot of times. There's a boss and a leader, and you really want to be a leader and not a boss. And that means you're empowering your team, you're engaging them. It's not about just telling people what to do, but it's really leading them to greatness. So the role of managers and supervisors are both considered leadership roles, and they overlap, but they have unique roles and responsibilities. And I think one of the challenges, often we use these terms, a manager or supervisor, interchangeably, and it does not always provide the person that's in those roles the direction on what their span of control is, what they're actually leading. And I've seen that when you have a manager who's trying to take some time off and they put someone in as maybe a temporary supervisor, and they're not well received. Well, it may be their approach, or they think they have more control over the situation. So we're going to kind of go through that today as well. The role of the supervisor is extremely important role in any organization, as this position has the responsibility to direct oversight of specific tasks, but usually without the overall managerial responsibilities of a manager. So I think that's the biggest thing, if you have a take-home message, is to really distinguish what the difference between a supervisor and a manager is. So the roles and functions of an effective supervisor will educate the healthcare professional supervisor on their role, the span of control, and ways to empower their team while gaining respect. So let's start with supervision. Supervision is an aspect of management that relates to directing an employee in a daily work task. So I think about in a skilled nursing facility, that's the setting that I primarily have been working in over my 30 plus years. And you may have a director of nursing who is the manager. She is overseeing everything, but she can't oversee everything. So she may have supervisors underneath her that are responsible for, say, scheduling or clinical training, with direct work tasks. Same with a therapy director. You may have a chief operating officer and then a regional manager. You have different layers of management, and they're all assigned certain tasks. So their goal is to assure that their performance, that the people they're supervising, their performance meets the established standards that supports organizational goals and objectives. Supervision is also defined as control and direction of work of one or more employees in a manner that promotes performance and higher quality outcomes. So although I know there was quite a few of you that said you're a staff therapist or assistant, you may be a supervisor. I know early in my career as an occupational therapist, I had 3 certified OT assistants that I supervised, and I had certain responsibilities that I was responsible for. So there's all different levels of supervision, and that's why it's super important to really realize what your span of control is. Yes, I may be supervising them clinically, but am I ultimately their boss? I have some input, but the overarching person is that manager that's over the entire department. So when you think of roles and functions, and it varies depending on what setting you're in, you as a supervisor may determine the daily priorities, the daily schedules. You may coordinate the work of others, maybe assigning schedules, assigning which patients they receive, evaluate their performance. So even at a supervisory level, back when I was a staff therapist and I was supervising some assistants, before I was in a director role or higher up, I was asked to be involved in evaluating the performance of my employees that I supervised, provide performance feedback to the supervisee, coach and train, you're mentoring. I think that's one of the biggest things about a supervisor is you're the person they're looking to for advice, for guidance. You may have some administrative duties that you're responsible for. If there's new policies and procedures out, you communicate those policies and procedures. Now, one thing with being a supervisor or a manager is you have a responsibility. And what that means is that you represent more than yourself. So if you're given that responsibility to be a supervisor, and maybe there's a policy or procedure that comes out that maybe you don't quite agree with, your responsibility is to go to your higher up and work through any concerns you have before you communicate that out to the supervisees. Address problems and conflicts. Sometimes it does not need to reach to the managerial level, to the chief operating officer, the CEO, because you can address it at the level you're at. You just have to determine that. Identify ways to improve efficiencies. You know, there's a lot of task force and committees, and a lot of times it'll be all the executive branch and the managers. But I think to really have an effective program, you have to get the feedback from the people that are actually doing the work. And that's one of the ways that you can really empower your teams and make sure that they know they're being heard. Identify ways to improve the work processes. Another great example of why you want to engage those who are actually doing the work in the decisions on how you're going to improve your work processes. So let's look at the difference between a manager and a supervisor. So I like to start with the supervisor. The supervisor is someone that is responsible for day-to-day operations, the direction of the department. They're task-oriented. They oversee the processes and activities. They're the ones that are in the weeds. They're internally focused and short-term. Where the manager is really looking at more of strategies, directions of the company, resources, budgets, the big picture. They're really looking at more globally the performance, external focused and long-term viability. When I was the chief operating officer of a rehab company, one of the things that, when I would get reports, I wanted the one-pagers because I had multiple buildings. And so, with 23 locations, you wanted to be able to very quickly see which ones maybe are struggling or maybe needed some feedback. And that way you could approach that regional or that director and get into the weeds and say, okay, hey, we're noticing your profitability is down. We're noticing some staffing challenges. We're noticing your cost, your margins are not where they need to be. Let's have them drill in. So that's kind of where there's no way to be successful as a manager if you're constantly staying in the weeds. And I think that's where some supervisors that graduate to a manager level struggle, because they're trying to stay in the weeds when they're a manager. And by doing that, those that they're supervising feel micromanaged. They don't feel like you trust them. Now, that's not saying that sometimes you do need to drill into the weeds, but as a manager, hopefully you're putting that person in place that you feel confident that they can drill into the weeds and give you the information that you need. So that's kind of a good tip when you hear about, what type of manager, my boss was a micromanager. They need to know every single level of detail. Well, to a point, but when you finally get your right team in place and you're feeling confident in your team, you should feel very confident in those that you're supervising, that they can give you the information you need without you having to drill in at super finite levels. So hopefully that's helpful. So the other thing is to understand what your span of control is. So to define the number of immediate subordinates who report to any one supervisor. And, in my many years in both operations and as a clinician, I think that's one of the things that I think is the most valuable to understand, because to be a good leader, sometimes, the people that you're supervising want to know that they have your attention. But if you're supervising 50 people, you're going to have a hard time if you're direct supporting, that many people. With the therapy company that I provided support to, we had 300 plus employees. Technically, I was the manager over 300 plus employees. Did I day-to-day supervise 300 employees? Absolutely not. And none of the folks on my team supervised that many, because there was a hierarchy. I had a level of regional managers that directly reported to me. And they usually tell you there's a certain number that, depending on what those tasks are you're overseeing, that you should really limit your direct reports, and then you'll progressively add additional layers. So in the setting that I've been primarily in with skilled nursing, we would have the chief operating officer, we would have maybe so many regionals depending on the geographic areas, and some additional support people. Then you had directors that had a therapy team that maybe consisted of 10 staff therapists. The larger programs, maybe that had 20 therapists, they maybe had an assistant director or maybe a team leader. All of those are considered supervisory roles, and they had a certain span of control they were responsible for. So a large therapy program, for those who are in inpatient rehab, we had a director of rehab and or director of therapy services, what we called them back then. We had someone that was coordinating the students. We had a team lead clinically. So there's all different types of levels, but your span of control is what are you responsible for in that role. And just because you're a supervisor doesn't mean that you are the king of the entire castle. You're in charge of that span. So there are additional factors affecting span of control to ensure a supervisor is effective in their role. And I've kind of already touched on a few, but it is a type of work, the degree of training. So sometimes in some environments, you have to be a licensed therapist to supervise in a management role assistants. Some facilities, they have assistants as directors of rehab. It just depends on your organization. Organizational stability, geographic location. So for those who have managed multi-site and they expect you to be on-site, it's a little different now with COVID and a lot more Zoom meetings that we've had in the past, but you will see folks out there that have a very large territory. At one time as a regional manager, I had 3 states. So I had to be very organized in my approach so that way I could provide all this necessary support. So all the people that I supervised felt like they were being supported. So you really do have to be very organized. The flow of the work, how you can work smarter, not harder. Your supervisor's qualifications, that may also drive how much span of control they may give you. Your ability of staff specialist. So, a PT to supervise, over PTs, OT over OT, speech over speech. Now, one thing about a director of rehab role, and I always state this, is that you also want to have knowledge in all the areas you supervise. So from a span of control, if you're a director of rehab and you happen to be a PT, you're not just supervising PTs, you're supervising multiple disciplines. So to be an effective supervisor, you have to familiarize yourself with all the different components of the different disciplines you support and the value systems of the organization. So this kind of guides you as far as your span of control. I always like this slide, and this is called the triangle of success. And I've seen it done in various ways, but from what we're discussing today, it's really referring to the KSA model, which is your knowledge, skills, and attitudes, which sometimes you see it as abilities. But in this circumstance, we're looking at attitudes. So your knowledge from a supervisor is, do you have the theories? Do you have the information, the facts, the figures, the description, and learning the science? You have all the information to be successful in your job. Now, from a manager, supervisor becoming a manager, can you set goals? Not just direct, but you have goals for your team. Maybe clinical documentation is a challenge. So you get together with the team and say, we're going to have a goal to have this completed by this date. Do you have good time management skills? As a supervisor, being there hours on end, managers being there hours on end, sometimes we think, we're kind of taking one for the team and stuff. Sometimes the job requires a lot of hours, and I will say I've worked a lot of hours in my days, but sometimes it's a time management issue, and you have to balance getting the job done and being accessible to your staff while also having life balance, because you don't want to burn yourself out. I've seen a lot of supervisors that want to be directors, and they leave that industry or they leave that position because they have no life balance. So you really want to look at that, and you do get better. I think anytime you take over a new program, you're going to have to invest a lot of time on the front end, but hopefully once you get your systems in place, then you'll see that balance come around. Good reasoning, communication, and interpersonal skills. And when I say communication, it's a two-way. You really have to be able to actively listen, and we're going to discuss that a little bit later in the presentation. But the other component of the triangle of success is attitudes. And I have to stress from an attitude standpoint that often I see people have the great knowledge and skills, but then you add the attitudes, and that's where it falls apart. They may be self-motivated, that maybe they're self-confident, but they're overconfident, and it rubs the people the wrong way. They have maybe integrity, but people question. If they question your integrity, that's a problem. You have to be honest in this role. You want someone that's optimistic, enthusiastic, cooperative, and committed. So if any of those areas break down, then you see someone struggle in that role. So to be an effective supervisor, you want to have a solid foundation of the technical knowledge of the position, desire to achieve high results and high levels, high expectation of achievement from others. So I always say I would never ask anyone to do anything I wouldn't do, but I have high standards for myself, but I also have high standards for my team. Obviously a high level of confidence and ability to instill a sense of value in others and ability to communicate effectively. So there's 4 models of supervision, and one is psychotherapy-based, developmental, social role, and eclectic, and we'll go over those. So the first one is the psychotherapy-based model, and this is that therapy-client relationship, and it is the supervisory to supervisory relationship. The focus is on the relationship that the supervisory feels, and this is a typo, I caught it, to reach out to the supervisor for support, being that available person, that go-to person. The supervisory is learning by observing, modeling, assisting, and receiving feedback from that supervisor. So it's just assisting that person, being kind of that role model. So I'm going to skip over this one for time's sake. So the developmental model is the supervision that defines progressive stages of the supervisory, and that's from a novice to an expert. So you start with each stage and you decrease your level of support as they become an expert. So the developmental model has been described as 3 stages. You start with a beginner, an immediate, and an intermediate, and an advanced. And then the 4th level will be where you kind of intertwine the 3 levels. Close supervision and support is required initially, But as supervisory grows and the need for supervision is reduced, the supervisory is given more autonomy. So I've been on that side of it, and I've also been on where I've been that supervisor. I remember a really great supervisor manager I had, and she initially was always available to me. And then she slowly but surely, I've been there several years, and we had a conversation. She said, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've really backed off. You don't need to ask my permission for every single thing. I really was confident, but it was like I was always looking for that self-assurance from her. And, you know, the way she handled it was she didn't always answer my call on the first ring. She'd let it go to voicemail. And then I would, you know, really need to make a decision. I'd make my decision, and I would tell her what my decision was. She'd sound like a great decision. So you don't want to become dependent on your supervisor. You want to eventually, as you're a supervisee, show that autonomy and show that you don't need that. And that's sometimes why people are micromanaged, because the supervisor thinks you need it, but maybe you don't. So the social role model is that approach to focus on roles and tasks and the function of the supervision. The social role model is based on the needs of the supervisee, and it changes, and the supervisor changes to meet the needs. The areas of skill building are communication, conceptualization, and personalization. And the last one, which is probably where I kind of lean toward, is because I kind of use the approach based on what the supervisee needs, is more of an eclectic approach. It's described as a customized approach, blending of various models of supervision based on the needs of the supervisee. This model stresses the need for the supervisee to utilize skills and approaches according to the level of the supervisee. If you've ever had a fairly large program, everyone doesn't come in at the same level. And so you really have to make sure that you're giving the attention to those that maybe are a little bit more seasoned, but maybe a little different attention. The role of the supervisor may begin as beginning a teacher, a counselor, or a consultant. So then you go into, we kind of talked about the approaches. Now the management approaches are, there's a systematic management approach, there is a human relation approach, qualitative approach, and contingency approach. We're going to kind of go through these very quickly. The manager relies on measurement and task analysis. So think of supervisors or managers you've had in the past, and they concentrate on the end result rather than the means. It's all about the numbers. Provide orderly and efficient plan of action, develop a coordination of specialized tasks. They use policies, procedures, formal work groups. They free management from many of the daily operations management. So they kind of take control of it. So those are the pros to it. But the cons may be that it may not be always lead to delays in decision making. If you feel like you have to take everything to a task force, it requires time to gather data. I've seen managers that want a consensus among the team. It doesn't always cater to contingencies well, and it may be not very dynamic and may stifle creativity when there may be a more creative plan. But this is a lot of times one of the approaches. And none of these approaches are better or worse. It's just they're different, and you have to decide your management approach and what best works for you. These managers on the human relation approach, they depend on the employees being engaged and part of the team. The pros is it improves productivity. You always want your team to want to work with you. I always say with you rather than for you, because if you can create a team approach, you're going to have better outcomes. Provide recognition and appreciate to the employees. A lot of times we focus our efforts on those that are our troubled employees, and we forget about the ones that are doing a really great job. Remove grievances among employees. It improves employee retention. It creates good relationships and goodwill of the company. So those are a lot of the pros. The cons are, it doesn't always show a roadmap. It may have more theoretical concepts, difficult to analyze, and loss of subjectivity, and structure sometimes lost. So although your employees may love you and they think that you're awesome, the people that you report to may find it, they want to know the numbers. They want to know the facts. How are you going to get to where that is? So you really have to balance the two approaches. So qualitative approach is using the views of experts to create a business forecast. Qualitative is often based on personal experiences and education. Statistics and data can test and validate approaches. But on the negative side, or the cons, is to seek to answer questions that cannot be answered solely from a quantitative angle. I had a supervisor that was very analytical, and I would come to, that individual and say, well, it's because, my experience, and this is why. And it doesn't always answer the hows and the whys. So it really challenges from an operation type manager. They want the math to improve the decision making. They cannot always support their cause and effect. So you have to really look at that. And the last one is the contingency approach, which is a manager adopts the best management style depending on the situation. And again, I think I probably lean toward this one. It's a little bit more dynamic and flexible. It improves your decision-making skills. It helps design the organizational structure, but it can be complex. It can be somewhat reactive in nature and inadequate support for the reasons of action. I would only say I've come to this contingency approach after being in this setting for so long. I would not say I leaned toward that. I probably leaned a lot more toward human relations and making sure everyone liked me. But as you grow as a manager, it's less important about being liked and it's more important about being respected. So we're going to discuss what would look like of a quality of a poor leader, and hopefully we can avoid that. So I think we've all had great supervisors and some not so great. So what do those characteristics look like? So some of the qualities of a poor leader would be poor integrity. I always say that, I've been in leadership roles for a long time, and I really try to hold my reputation very strong. I want to make sure that when I retire, that people, I may not have been perfect, but people respected me, that they felt like I was a strong, really good leader, and I always kept my word. And if for some reason I'm not able to keep my word, that I go back and I describe the barrier or whatever that situation is, so they're not left hanging and think that I wasn't being truthful. Lack of adaptability. Great leaders know how to employ a range of leadership styles. Like I said, being flexible with your style depending on what the situation occurs for. Not every situation is the same course of action can work. Lack of vision. This is where a lot of leaders get lost. People love their supervisor, but the higher up managers, they don't see them pushing forward. They don't have a vision for the department or the company, and they may be asked to leave. And the supervisees are left going, well, gosh, we really like them. Why did they not keep that person? But unfortunately, that leader is also responsible to push forward. They have to be focused on how to make tomorrow efficient and productive. So they're looking at everything. Lack of accountability. The best leaders take accountable for what things go wrong and give credits to others that go right. Often I'd be praised that something we would do really wonderful as a team. And I always would tell them, it's not me. My team makes me look good. Thank you so much for acknowledging them. And if there was someone to give credit to, I would give that specific credit. But on the flip side, if we messed up, guess who took all the responsibility? It wasn't me in that meeting going, oh, well, that was Susie. She screwed up. Well, you know what? Who's over Susie? I'm over Susie. So you have to unfortunately, it's a little bit of a lonely spot to be in, but if something bad goes down, you have to take that full accountability. You can address it privately with your teams, but with those higher ups that you report to, you are ultimately responsible for everything that you are overseeing. And then poor communication skills. It doesn't matter how effective a leader is able to draw up. You can have a great plan, but if you're not able to communicate it to those that are going to hopefully implement it, you're not going to make much progress. They have to be part of it. The other thing, and I stress this because it was one thing that I struggled with when I was a new leader, was listening, active listening. I tend to think very quickly, and I have lots of ideas in my head, and I want to just spew them out. But some of the best advice that I've given young leaders, and they've told me that it helps, is to take a moment. And if you're someone that's just kind of a chatty Cathy or a talker, one of the habits that I got into was I'd always have a notepad handy. And I'd have it handy, and so right when someone come in and start talking to me, I'd start writing notes. First of all, it's good practice because you're not going to remember every detail. That way you can repeat it back so you know that you're actively listening to them. And if you're really having trouble, and I gave this advice to one of my team members, water. It sounds silly, but have a bottle of water or something close by so you can take a moment, pause, drink the little sip of water, don't choke on it, and set it back down, just to give yourself that moment to pause. Because some of us are a little bit hyper and we want to spew everything out. So what makes a great leader? So a quality of a great leader is someone that can stay positive even in the worst situations. I've had to give, bad news, to teams. We've had to let go of staff. You name it, I've probably seen it. But depending on how you handle that situation is going to make a difference. Unfortunately, in my days, I've had to let go of team members, and I've actually had team members that I've seen back out in the grocery store or something actually come to me and thank me for the way I handled it, said they found a really great opportunity. And it doesn't always go that smoothly, but trying to just be as positive as possible. Exhibit confidence, have a sense of humor. Sometimes, they always say if you want to cry, sometimes you have to laugh because you want to cry. You have to have a sense of humor, but not at the expense of your team members. Embrace failures and manage setbacks. For every setback I've ever had, I've learned something, and it's made me a better manager. Listen, and give feedback. And when you're giving feedback, know your audience too. If you're giving feedback to a group, you don't want to hurt someone's feelings. Some people are more sensitive than others. Others don't need the sugar coat, they want to be direct. But you have to know your folks. Know how and when to delegate. That's probably the other big thing that I would stress that I struggle with as a manager is I thought I did everything better. Well, guess what? That doesn't make your supervisees feel like you respect them and that you understand them and that you can empower them. So a good leader can delegate. If you can't go on vacation for a week, and if your whole department falls apart, then you need to relook at your leadership strategies and see if you're empowering people, because I can guarantee you have someone that is in your department that wants to take parts of those responsibilities off your plate. They have that fire and desire. Inspire and grow those people around you and take responsibility, never blame others, make decisions based on lessons learned in the past. And I do think because I've had so many experiences to draw from, it does help you as a leader. I had a manager once tell me something that happened, and she expected me to be really reactive. And I was just very calm. And she's like, "Why aren't you getting excited about it?" And it's like, well, I didn't want to dismiss it, but I was like, "Oh, been there, done that. I've seen that." It's not the first time I've heard it. Maybe the first time I'd heard a circumstance such as what I was informed about, I may have been a little bit more reactive. But because I've had that experience, I was like, okay, well, now thank you for the information, ask the appropriate questions, and then we put a plan together, because whatever the situation has already happened, nothing we can do about it. Now we've got to move on to our action. Lead by example and commit to do the best. And I will tell you, as a manager or supervisor, your supervisees are watching you. They're watching your actions, every action that you're doing. And I don't say this to get managers or supervisors paranoid, but the reason I say that is I'll give an example. Occasionally we would be needing a therapist to do an evaluation. Well, I'm an occupational therapist. I have a license. So I would jump in and do an evaluation. Well, as a supervisor or a manager, we audit the therapists that are to make sure that the documentation is at that level of quality. Well, now the question is, Ms. Supervisor, Ms. Manager is doing an evaluation. Does it rise to that same level? So really, they're expecting your work to be at their level or above. They have a higher standard for you. Same with the services you provide. If they're watching you do therapy, they're observing you. It's just something that you want to be aware of because they are modeling you. They are also observing. I always kind of had I don't want to say a policy, but kind of my mantra is like for taking people to lunch. I would take somebody for lunch if it was their anniversary, because we were obviously, celebrating their anniversary, maybe doing a review. But on a personal basis, I didn't tend to socialize individually with just one or two of my therapists because it would look like favoritism. So I tended to, if I was going to have a lunch, it would be with the entire team, so that there was never that perception, because again, you're being watched and observed. So the common reasons people will typically leave a position is not because of money. A lot of people think it. Sometimes it is a factor, but it is typically for culture, environment, need of more challenge, feeling uninspired, or wanting meaningful work. Again, that delegation, wanting to feel valued and recognized. And that's your seasoned ones and your newer ones. Sometimes we focus on the new ones, but you really got to focus on everyone. Seeking a better management relationship if they don't feel it's working for them. They're looking for growth and advancement. So that's one thing that every time that I would do an annual review, I would ask my regionals or my therapists what their ultimate goals were. Because you might find someone that's pretty quiet that maybe wants to be a manager or a supervisor, or they have some aspirations that you could mentor within your own setting and not lose them to another provider because they don't think there's an opportunity for them. Need for more feedback or structure. So these are questions you can ask them. Wanting a different environment, which sometimes there's nothing you can do about, sometimes salary, and the life balance. So keys to motivating your team is to set clear goals, do what you say, foster collaboration, empower your teams, show you trust your teams, acknowledge their accomplishments, celebrate their success, and create a fun environment. They say that, we spend more time often at our work than our personal, in our homes. And in that case, you want to be excited about coming in. And if you see everyone kind of down on the mouth and they're all sad and they just look like it's a job, it's a task, look at your culture and your environment and what you can do. So there's a book called The Energy Bus that I highly recommend. It's a short, quick read, and it talks about different ways to kind of motivate. And it talks about being available to them and listening to them, recognize them, and serving them. Although they're there to, work for you, you are there to work for them and bring out the best in them. And I think that's, my key words. And I love closing out with this quote from John Quincy Adams says, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you're a leader. So hopefully this information has been helpful for those who are desiring to be a leader, those who are a leader, and I will open the floor up to questions and we'll go from there. What is the best way to encourage staff therapists to understand they are in a supervisory role? Okay, so what is the best way to encourage staff therapists to understand they're in a supervisory role? I think it's just going over their span of control. Like I was referring to when I was a staff therapist, but I was a supervisor, is basically explaining what the responsibilities are. So kind of going down, okay, it's not just a matter of you signing their notes. You're responsible as the lead therapist or their supervisor to ensure that the quality of their documentation is good. There's no reason why they can't assess that before, but I think really going over their span of control would be a good start. So hopefully that helps. So how to motivate your staff if you don't feel you have a cheerleader personality? Well, that's okay too. I love that. I love that question. I think that the way to do that is to identify maybe that cheerleader in your group. I think that's where, and I think that's just, everyone is hardwired one way from a personality standpoint. So it may be that you have someone that's got that more cheerleader approach. And I will tell you, and I had 6 people that I directly supervised for a long time over this rehab company. And I had one that I would describe as my cheerleader. And the great thing about it is if I was presenting something that maybe wasn't as popular sometimes, and I'll admit it, I would give her a call in advance and say, I'm going to talk about this really difficult topic. And what do you think about it? She said, oh, this is great, da, da, da. And she would chime in, and it was kind of contagious. So maybe finding that cheerleader among your team that can kind of help, kind of draw those pom-poms. What is your best method to help low performers? Well, it depends on what the low performance is. I think of productivity for one. And some of that is really looking at why they're struggling with whatever it is. Sometimes it's they're not producing from a units perspective. Maybe it's a billable guidelines opportunity. A lot of it's training. Sometimes they're not in the right setting. One of the individuals I had a real hard time with documentation. We were in a fairly large gym, couldn't get her notes done. And what we found when we kind of really dug into it was the reason she was having trouble is she was so easily distracted because of the gym and the noise. So, she did really well with, headsets. We got her, the noise cancellation, sounds crazy, but noise cancellation headsets so she could concentrate. With therapists that are ineffective with maybe their time management and maybe looking at how they schedule, it really is going to depend on what the reason for this from that perspective is. I would just, bring them in, and you got to decide on who's going to bring them in. So if it's a low performer, depending on its multiply, if I brought them in as a COO, they'd be scared. They'd be like, why is she needing to talk to me? So you may want to talk to that direct supervisor and say, let's do some assessment. And sometimes it's just not a good fit for them. Maybe they're not happy. So you got to get to the root of the problem. They kind of describe it as the 5 whys of what is causing that. So hopefully that helps. It's hard to give an answer without a specific situation. What is the best way to promote team when your therapy staff have division? Yeah, that's a tough one. That is a real tough one. Staff have divisions. So I think it's a matter of getting them to figure out what the commonality is. And the best example I can think of immediately when I think of therapy divisions in departments, sometimes it's inter-departments. So, nursing and therapy, that they're just dividing. And if you can figure out a way to get them to see why we're all here for the same reason. The challenge I had was when I had the therapist, and the nurses kind of going out, I said, you know what, if we can make this whole issue about the resident and not about you personally, then we're going to come to the right solution. And that was a little bit eye-opening because we kind of put our personal aside and our differences and really made it about the resident, because we're all in the healthcare business and we're trying to get good outcomes and really try to retool that. It's just that another good book for there's The No Complaining Rule, which is from John Gordon. I agree. It's an excellent book. I also had a meeting that I had my regional managers, and we were having a little bit of division, kind of like what the other question was related to. And I came up with basically it was, what did I say? I said, we would not move forward without a complaint. I'm trying to remember. I had a little catchy phrase that I had it. Oh gosh, I'm on the spot and I can't remember it. No excuses, just solutions. That's what it was. So we had the little stickies. I love my stickies on the walls. I put my stickies on the wall and we were talking through different issues and stuff like that. And the managers were coming up with all the problems. And we would stop every time and say, okay, that's a problem. We're not moving forward till we come up with 3 solutions. And we would just stay on it. And I didn't care how long it was going to take. We were going to work through those solutions. And they finally started flipping that narrative. And you can do that with the department. I've done that with the department. Now, sometimes people don't want to do that because they don't want anyone to know. So another way is getting the little stickies and having people, put them in a, okay, here, just stick it in a hat. Here's your solutions. Try not to say if you know their handwriting. So that way you can, give their, confidence, So some people are funny about that. Let's see. Can you talk through an example of challenging situation as a manager and what you did to overcome the challenge? Who do you use as a mentor, or what resources do you use to develop leadership skills? Okay, a 2-part question. Can you talk through an example of challenging situation as a manager and what you did to overcome the challenges? I'm thinking there's been a lot of challenges. I think the challenge that comes to mind right when I first think about that is being a staff therapist and of a large, this is fairly early in my career, I was a staff therapist at a large, this is pre-PDPM, so the therapy department had 35 therapists and assistants in there. I was one of them. And the manager and the director got let go. And I was approached to interview for the position. And I actually just temporarily was the interim. I was kind of assisting. I had some management experience, had no desire to run for the position, but after they interviewed multiple candidates, they decided I was the best candidate, even though I didn't interview. But what happened is that one day I'm their coworker, and the next minute I'm their manager. And I think it was very challenging at that time because they had to see me in a new light. And a lot of times that's where our leaders start. And what I did was literally with a really great manager that she guided me to, I met with each of the therapists and assistants individually and the aides and everyone that worked, with me, and kind of told them my vision and asked them for feedback and what they liked about their past. Because a lot of them liked the manager, but she just didn't work out. What they were looking for, and really kind of got their input. So it really made a good start. The other thing that I didn't realize was they had a lot of turnover with managers. So some people were concerned for me because they liked me and thought, oh gosh, she's going to be flipped out as well. But I ended up staying for a long time, and I got promoted from there, and I promoted someone within. So it did turn out positive. I think your question on who I look for is, I really have looked at different leaders, and I've had some tough managers that, I would say at the time I didn't understand their method between their madness. But now looking at it in retrospect, I really do appreciate I've picked up some certain skills from them. And there's not one leader in particular. I do read books and stuff that I like that kind of give me some guidance. But I do think your best learning experience just comes from leading and people that you really respect. What approach do you recommend for an assistant who is very sensitive to feedback when they have made a mistake? And I've had that too. Sometimes I ask them how I can better communicate. I mean, I used to joke about it in my earlier career that I hated writing up people. I hated disciplining people because I would cry before they would cry because I just hated it that much. Now, the higher you get up in management, you're less connected with your reports. So it's not as hard, but it's still hard, or you just get a little better. I don't ever want to be cold, but I know I had one regional that I would give feedback to and they'd get very upset. And I'd have another one that was just stoic. And I was like, okay, am I getting through to them? And so I sometimes would turn the tables and say, you know what, I got to give you some feedback. How do you like to be approached? Because I need to give you this feedback, and how, and then, because sometimes you may be trying to do it as sensitive as possible. Now, they call it the sugar sandwich, and I do think it sometimes works for those who are really sensitive, where you give them something very positive, you give them the news, and then you back it up with another positive. So that's another approach that I've seen to be successful. And I do use that occasionally when need to be. Let's see, we've got a few more minutes. Let me see if I can get through some of these questions. Coming in as a supervisor is someone that is quite a bit older and has worked in a position for 12. Yeah, I've been there too. I've been there from a staff position, and I've been there. And it's hard. I think what you have to do is you have to respect their years of experience. And if there's anything that you can acknowledge that they can, like looking for them for input, don't be condescending. Oh, I know you've been out of school for a zillion years or whatever, but getting their opinion, engaging them in the decision making, giving them tasks if they want it. Some don't want it. They're like, no, I'm here. You're the boss. That's what you're getting paid, the big bucks, whatever. But trying to engage them, but really respecting their knowledge. One of the examples that I think about when we had an administrator, I didn't directly supervise this gentleman, but he asked me for advice. Very young. He could be my son. And he was not being well received. And that was because people like me who had 30 years experience, other regionals, other consultants that would come into his facility were giving him advice, but he was dismissing it because he knew it and he was in charge of that building. And when he left, because it didn't be a good fit, he asked for my opinion. And that was my first thing to him, was to respect those that came before you. They may not have all the answers, but they may give you some guidance how you can be a better manager, and you need to listen. And I think that was the biggest thing, is just making sure that you pull them in, respect them, and don't dismiss them. Now, the one thing that I think gets old, even being someone experienced, is, well, this is the way we've always done it. Well, that's great. That's one way of doing it. Let's look at another way. Because, what do they say? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing and getting the same, expecting a different result. Now, we're right at the hour. I want to be respectful of your time, but let me see if I can answer a few more questions, unless they need me to get cut off. As a staff member, how can we deal with poor leadership, micromanaging, lack of support, poor morale? Well, as a staff member, it's hard. I would say, if you have not already approached that supervisor, if you're having some challenges, and you got to gingerly approach that, because sometimes they're not very insightful, you may have to take it to the next level. And that's hard. And there is a risk with that, depending on how you feel about that. There's also things called employee surveys that a lot of companies do. And a lot of employees, and I've been the ones that have sent those out, and the percentage of completion is very low. And if you get 50%, you're doing good. And a lot of reasons it's low is because everyone's afraid that they're going to be recognized. Now, if you do an identifying, certain situation, yeah, you might be identified as a survey, but most of those are fairly confidential. And if you can keep it fairly generic, you can get your information out there. And it does sometimes hurt. I've been on the other side of it. I think I'm a pretty good supervisor. I think I'm a pretty good leader. But I've been called out on things that I've done, and it has made me, in retrospect, go, oh, wow, and it hurts. But, it was insightful. I was glad I knew it. I didn't go after that person. I was glad to have the feedback, because sometimes in these roles, people don't want to give you the feedback directly. So, I would just look at your chain of command and see if you can communicate that. Usually, I will say, and it doesn't always happen, usually poor leaders, and I've seen this happen, eventually, it may take longer than you want, eventually it works itself out, because someone above them, they're going to have poor performance, they're going to have poor retention. If I have turnover, a lot of turnover in a facility, I'm looking at that leader to see if it's something to do with that leader and not just the pay and their approach. So hopefully the people above them are insightful enough to identify. And I think I'm going to take, let's see, I don't know how many more questions I can take. I'll take them. I'm okay for my time. I am a PT and a supervisor to a small PT team and an outpatient. So it looks like you just have like a handful, 3. What is the best way to approach clinical management owner speech therapist about her poor communication skills? I feel it's my job to relay the information to her for the PT group, but don't know how to approach it. I've not been in this, I guess it's been so many years, I'm not shy anymore. So if I really did see a area of opportunity with my super, I would gingerly approach it. And kind of what I said, no excuses, just solutions, not come at her or him in an attack mode, but just, hey, I'm not sure of the exact situation, but say there's something that she's communicating. Maybe she doesn't really understand PT. And you, as that representative of your team, just very gingerly approach, whatever that situation. Most people, so I've tried it both ways. I've tried to be very generic because I don't want to hurt their feelings. But typically people that are not as insightful need direct examples. When you did X, or when you presented this, it made us feel, or, they interpret it by, or us as a team, don't say they, because that's an us and them. We interpret it as this, and maybe give them some insight. It just depends on how receptive they are to take that. Well, I appreciate all of the questions. I think we got to most of them. And so if I'm just going to go ahead and end it there. Thank y'all so much. Hopefully y'all found this educational.